Hey everybody, welcome. We're glad to have you here. We'd like to get our next speaker started. So if you are within the sound of my voice, you're welcome to join us. Come take a seat. We still have some seats available. And for those of you here, please put your hands together. And from Imperva, welcome Peter Klimek.
All right, great. Thank you very much. How's everyone doing today? Good. So who do I have in the audience that their primary responsibility is security? Good handful of people. Everyone else from development operations backgrounds in here? Okay, great. So my role at Imperva, I'm a principal architect. Basically what that means is that I work with organizations across the globe, some of the largest in the world, to help solve application and data security challenges. Prior to joining Imperva, I worked at a financial services organization as a security architect. Now, at that time, what was really interesting was that organization was first starting its DevOps maturity, and it was starting to go through the process. So we had some really interesting challenges that came up, and so one of the things I want to do today is just share you my experiences in working as an organization, as a practitioner, and now consulting with some of the largest organizations in the world, and really some of the observations that I've made in determining what really sets them apart from those that are successful in adopting security in a DevOps world, and those that tend to struggle a little bit more with it. So about a year ago, I was actually here as well, and I was just during some downtime browsing Twitter, and I came across this tweet. And it was one of those tweets that just immediately jumped out to me. I had to save it. And this is really speaking more to the developer crowd, but I think ultimately it really resonated with me as a security practitioner as well. And just to go on a little bit further here, really the big thing about DevOps as a whole is that it is about making software safer. It is about making software more repeatable. As security practitioners, this is what we want. When development teams and organizations are saying we want to go on a DevOps journey, the security team needs to embrace that. They need to think about that as a positive because ultimately, at the end of the day, everything that DevOps strives for is aligned with security goals. So this is great. This is exactly what we want. So now, ultimately, what ends up happening to be the biggest challenge for security teams in a DevOps world? I kind of just gave away the answer with the tweet, but ultimately what sets apart organizations that are successful versus those that aren't is mindset. It's not technology. It's not specific aspects of how you're implementing or doing certain things. It's really the mindset that you're using to approach the problem in the first place. And this is really where I find to be the key differences in the way people start to think about problems. So now, for security practitioners that don't come from development backgrounds, maybe they don't even come from an operational background, I mean, ultimately, security people are trained to think like attackers. We're not trained to think like developers. So there's a lot of things that we have to do to try to shift and to get into this mindset. So how do we do that? First, we really need to understand some of the core tenets of DevOps. We really need to start thinking about what is it that the development teams are actually looking at, what are they trying to do, and how do we actually start to fit into this model a little bit better. The first thing is really that it always focuses on the people. That's the first and most important thing. And the biggest part of that is the collaboration. So as you're going in and as you're working with your development teams, you need to take a collaborative approach to understanding some of their challenges. So you need to understand what are their existing processes, how are they using their technology today. For anyone that just was here for the last presentation, we had GitLab up on stage, and they were walking through some of their CI/CD processes and different tools within Git. It was amazing. I feel like that's a presentation that every single security practitioner probably should have seen, not because it's important to use their tooling, but just to understand how developers are looking at their own processes and what they can do to augment those. One of the stages that they talked about was how do you go through a build pipeline and be able to ensure that code quality is secure as part of it. So doing static analysis within it, doing dynamic analysis within it. So there's a lot of opportunity within there to be able to integrate directly within those tools. It doesn't matter what tools the development teams choose to use, as long as you have mechanisms to be able to work with it. One of the points that I did want to make around here too is as you're looking at architectures, you need to first have a good understanding of what the architectures look like. This is one of the first things that I always learned right away is that as you get into these conversations, one of the things we always want to look at is what does your existing data flows look like in your environment? From a security perspective, we use this information because we want to look for what are the potential threat vectors here? What are the things that I need to be concerned about? What are the challenges that we might face around regulatory compliance? That's always one of the most important aspects of it. then we can start to look at actually applying security solutions in on top of it. But we can't just come and say and hammer in certain solutions because this is what we've always done. We need to choose the right solutions that can actually fit their processes. So the next major tenet, one of the big things that you're going to see probably on the infrastructure side, but interestingly, you're going to get it a lot on the development teams right now, is then this notion of incremental changes, especially when it comes to things like state management. If you look at infrastructure across the board, infrastructure is effectively stateful. Everything there has a distinct state and time. Now, there's interesting, I would say a renaissance. It's actually happening as well in the front-end development world right now, where a lot of developers are starting to think about things as immutable objects. So for security practitioners, that needs to be part of your vocabulary as you're starting to talk to organizations. You need to think about immutability. You need to think about immutability not just as the individual items that you're working with as a security side, but also the infrastructure-related components. This gives you the ability to very distinctly control what changes are happening through an environment as you're working through it, and it allows you to fit in those processes. Now, even better is if your security controls can also follow those same models, if you can start change controlling your actual security changes, if you can start deploying them in similar ways that the application teams are doing it, it makes it a lot easier for them to understand if something goes wrong. If something starts getting blocked and the development teams are scratching their heads and trying to understand why this traffic is getting blocked when it wasn't yesterday, ultimately you have a change record. You have something that tells them that we made this change and this went in there, and they have visibility into that. It's an important aspect in order to be able to stop pointing the fingers across the board to people. So just some general ideas of how we've generally implemented this with customers. One thing that we started doing is just building security into the application. Outside of just the normal secure development practices that we've seen, we've literally started packaging security code alongside the application through our runtime application security protection. Now, what this allows us to do is as the development teams then are going through their unit testing, as they're going through their integration tests, they have all of that security logic bundled into the application directly. So they're able to identify issues early in the development process. The fastest time to fix a bug, the fastest time to fix a security vulnerability is at the time when the developer has their hands on the code right there. It's at the time of unit testing. So if you're able to integrate directly as part of their build process within there, we can make sure that we can actually address any sort of potential issues before they come to a halt. We ultimately don't want to get to a point where we're only testing things and seeing the full end-to-end process when it truly gets to production, because that means you're going to run into instances where you have to do things like rollbacks. So we don't want to do that. We don't want to impact the developers too much within it, but we want to make sure that we're still achieving our security goals. So this is a great way to be able to do it. One of the things that we'll often do in this is we'll actually package this as part of the main container artifact. So it goes into the container registry, and then we can just deploy it wherever we want to. So if they're using EKS, if they're using ECS, if they're using Fargate, even if they're using just standard EC2 instances, JVMs, .NET runtimes, great, no problem. As long as we package that into all of the artifacts, everything that we need is controlled in state directly there, and that's what we ultimately want. Now, one of the other things we've seen that's really interesting as part of this collaboration is that we can also start to create really tight feedback loops. This is one thing that I think is really, really amazing, is that development teams, operations teams have unparalleled visibility into their infrastructure today. The type of visibility that security teams dreamed of having 10 years ago into what's happening, what's talking to what components are within there. And now ultimately, there's a lot of great initiatives that are starting to come to pass that development teams, operations teams are really looking into. The Cloud Native Computing Foundation guys are just right down there over in the booth. The Kubernetes project, the Istio project, those are great things. They solve major, major problems for the DevOps teams and the infrastructure teams, but they also solve very, very big security challenges. And so when we create those tight feedback loops, when we work with the organizations, the security teams can look at how they can leverage and augment some of those existing technologies, things that weren't even necessarily designed for security, but we can now use that for logging, and we can use that for our own purposes. Internally, we use tools like Jaeger and Zipkin to be able to understand distributed transaction tracing. So there's lots of different things that we can now see within the environment that we previously never really had access to. One other thing that we've really liked to see, some of our more advanced customers are actually starting to do more and more things with basically taking all of the data feeds that the application teams are getting, they're ingesting all that information in, they're throwing it into something like Kinesis, they're actually doing analysis in on top of that, and then they're creating these very tight feedback loops. These are important because they're able to solve problems like fraud and application abuse. Things that aren't necessarily application layer vulnerabilities, but they tend to be more business logic layer vulnerabilities. You can do these processes where you can monitor and understand what traffic is under what's going through your environment. You can look for certain indicators that this might be malicious traffic. We do client classification at the front door. We understand if we're talking to a bot, we're talking to a mobile application. If the person that we are seeing talk to the application has tried to issue DDoS attacks against other organizations, we know all of that information. We can pass back that information in HTTP request headers that all gets into the application. We can run correlation on the back end, and then we can create this tight feedback loop where we're automatically pushing out rules to our edge ingress filtering. So whether we're using AWS WAF, our SecureSphere WAF, our Encapsula WAF, another third-party service, the important thing is that you make sure that your tools that you have, that you're leveraging, have robust APIs that make this possible. There's no way we would be able to do this by going into logging in and clicking on buttons. So ultimately, we want to have rich access to APIs to be able to do this. And that's always something that you should put at the top of your criteria list as a security practitioner when you're evaluating new technologies. So one very important thing that I've often seen going into it, and talking with many security practitioners throughout the years, most people didn't come from a development background in security. So a lot of the tooling that the development teams are using, a lot of the tooling that the operation teams are using, you're probably just not familiar with it. And so one of the best things I think that you can do is to familiarize yourself with it. So the really big 3 projects that I feel that every single person needs to know across the board is, number 1, you've got to know Git. I mean, it doesn't need to be a specific vendor implemented version of it or platform, just the raw command line Git version. There's a wealth of information that's available out there. It's a great starting point. This gives you the initial building blocks that you need to start change controlling all of your configurations, managing it as a security team, and basically starting to work through everything. Additionally, everything that you're going to do in AWS, you're probably going to be doing through SDKs, so Boto 3 and Python. Python, we actually just released an article recently that Python is the #1 language of hackers as a whole, so it makes sense that you would probably also know Python in there. It's also the #1 language for DevOps folks. And last but not least, we have the Swagger Open API initiative. This is great. This basically gives you the ability to understand what are the applications doing. As developers are going and writing and documenting their APIs, if they're doing it properly, they're probably documenting it using Swagger and the Open API spec. It gives them a great way to declaratively say what their REST-based application's doing. And then as a security practitioner, as you're looking through the application, as you're looking at the attack surface, as you're looking at what are the potential avenues of exploit within there or abuse, I can look at the Swagger schema for an application, and I can use that to help me understand where we might have some additional areas where we need to monitor it or we need to augment with additional ruling and capabilities. We need to detect whether we might have abuses of logins over in one area or balance transfers are in another. So as you're going back, as you're working with your DevOps teams, just remember, it really is all about the mindset. It's the mindset that we have to get into as security practitioners to start actually bridging this gap and to live in this world. The technology is less important. It's more about how you're approaching and solving the individual problems itself. Thank you guys very much. Are there any questions? Anything else?
And if there are any questions, I'll be happy to bring you the microphone. Yeah? Okay.
Oh, one thing I didn't mention too. Here's a link to our GitHub account. We are regularly posting tools and technology that we're using internally. We're really committing to publishing a lot of what we're doing, making it easier for you to use not only our own products, but also some SDKs that we're writing for just solving common challenges internally. So please do look at our GitHub account. We are regularly posting lots of information, lots of different projects up there.
Thanks, Peter. So I like that slide where we're showing the 3 basic components that everyone should know is Git, Boto, and the Open API. I was wondering where the AWS offered services fit into that spectrum. So Boto obviously is AWS SDK, but then they have loads of tools out there. Where do they fit in there in the world of DevSecOps?
I think it ultimately will depend on the use cases and the challenges that you're trying to solve. AWS is doing a great job of making tools accessible, making it so that you can actually leverage a lot of those capabilities. Just internally, we see AWS's WAF as being a good starting point for a lot of application teams to start getting their hands dirty to working with the WAF, to understanding how it actually works. Imperva collaborated last year at reInvent to release some new rule sets for it at Above and Beyond. So that's a tool that we definitely see. Macy, GuardDuty are another ones that we definitely see across the board. And I have to give AWS credit too, that they've done a great job about all of the new tools that they make available. They also make it accessible through tools like Bodo 3. So if you are using it, if you do want to make it as part of your stacks that you have, just automate it through the actual SDK.
Anybody else? Questions? Yep.
Hello.
Hi there.
I have a question here. We do have pipelines completely built on Jenkins. We use CloudBees, and just the deployment happens in the AWS. We deploy to Lambda. So in that case, so how do we implement this kind of security thing in the?
Yeah. So. Serverless applications, there's always a lot of challenges that you can have from a security team's perspective to trying to protect those. Ultimately, what we see is that you still have an ingress to that application. You still have a natural choke point to be able to deal with that traffic. And so ultimately, what we look to do is always protect that traffic still at that natural ingress point. So a lot of times the security team and the network team still controls the DNS. They still have some control over how that traffic is happening. And so if you do need to put in those checks, you generally want to front load those beforehand. Now, that does make it a little bit more challenging from a testability perspective because it gets away from that that ability to really build it into the stack. So ultimately, you do have to do a little bit more around your integration testing processes to make sure that you didn't break anything. But ultimately, I do think that you can have rich functional tests as well, and that's always a good way to surface problems before it ends up happening. So, yeah, great question.
Any other questions? Going once, going twice? All right, I think we're good.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.